Good afternoon. We're just starting the webinar and we have a number of people joining and coming in at the moment. So we'll just give it a couple of moments for participants to enter. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brett Blacker, CEO of English Australia. I'm delighted to be here today to present the industry market analysis and the results from the 2020 ELICOS Market Survey. Today, I'll be joined by our partner in the research, Svetlana Cruz, who's the Senior Research Manager from Bonnard. I'm sure many of you who have participated in this survey would have had contact with Svetlana, or one of the great team from Bonnard who's assisted in the data collection process and worked with many of our member colleges and stakeholders who've participated in today's survey. So today our aim is to present the results, and before we do that, I'd just like to acknowledge some of our partners who have supported this, the research being undertaken this year as well. So moving on, I'm going to firstly provide my specific thanks to the Department of Education, Skills and Employment. This survey has been funded for 26 years now. It's supported largely through the support of Department of Education, Skills and Employment. It's with their assistance that we're able to offer the survey at no cost to participants. And for those that participate, obviously we also provide a full report for the details of the findings. There is an executive summary which is available for those that are viewing the presentation today but haven't participated, and that will be made publicly available as well. We'll be in contact with all of the participating providers around distribution of the full report. So thanks very much to the Department of Education, Skills and Employment. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Bonnard, who I noted are our research partner and undertake a great deal of the work in collecting the information, working with providers where there needs to be any data reviewed, and then the analysis of that and of those data points. So having Svetlana here today is brilliant. She's very close to all of the actual outcomes and findings. Over the past few weeks, I've presented a number of the state findings at the various branch meetings and state forums, where we've covered just the main trends. But today, collectively across the state data, we'll have Svetlana here to present that for you as well. And as always, we've been supported by Allianz Global Assistance, and Allianz has been our partner in undertaking the research and analytical components of the work that we do for a number of years. And a special thanks to Allianz, who continue to provide us the support. In today's session, we are going to look firstly at the broad sector analysis, specifically from the outcomes of the 2020 survey. Within there, we'll put some context around Australia's position. We will look at the student profile and the makeup of the demographics of each of the students. Flowing down from a regional level to then the top 10 source countries. As many of you will be aware, in recent years, we introduced provider type data, which enabled us to analyse the student numbers based on the type or category of college participating. And that's given us a far greater level of insight into student volumes based on different college types. Moving into the state overview, and for those that may have seen their state, we'll have the full picture, the national data presented, and then some of the unique data around COVID impact. So first of all, looking at the overall sector analysis, what we experienced in 2020 was an enormous decline. I think that's an understatement. 47% in both student numbers and student weeks. Though looking back and recalling, this is as at December 2020, and the first few months of December or 2020, up until March, we still had borders opened and student flows were actually positive until that point. As the year flowed, we did see a dramatic increase up until, particularly in the third quarter, when it was over 50% decline and over 70% decline in the final quarter of 2020. Comparing this number, these statistics to Department of Education, we looked at December 2020, there was a 43.3% decline in student numbers. But here we can note that there's been essentially 90,000 student weeks compared to 169, and going back a year prior, it's almost half the market from what we experienced in 2018. And in student weeks, around 2.3 down to 1.2, so almost 50% decline, over 1 million weeks lost in the year of 2020 alone. On student visas, and this has been a stat I've sort of spoken about a couple of times, the actual student visa performance in just with excluding non-student and working holiday, the numbers have taken essentially 10 years of growth away from the sector. And so we're taking what our total student body on student visas alone was in 2020, was back to where we were around 10 years ago, back in 2010. Now, in that, where I guess what we are excluding in those numbers is the non-student visas. And when we look at the comparison between student and non-student, the picture actually gets a little bit worse again. So what I'll do now, moving on to the student and non-student data, it does give a breakdown of, I'll pick that up in a minute. I'll quickly just touch on our global position. We stayed relatively the same in 2020, largely at this point because some of our competitor countries haven't been able to publish their 2020 data. But overall, in terms of our position, Australia continues to hold number 2 position overall in terms of student weeks and average length of stay. Roughly estimated at around 22% of the global market share being taught in Australia in that period, despite the downturn. I guess looking at it and from what we know in terms of other data reported, the UK took sort of a slight increase over that same period of time. In terms of our student profile, and here we'll look at the difference between the student visa and non-student visa market. As an aggregated set, 47% down, although when we look at the breakdown between the two, the share of students in population has increased in the non-student category. So last year, it was around 70% of the total market was in the student visa category, and that's increased from 70 to 74, with the non-student visa category declining from 30% down to 26%. Major students, I guess, in terms of nationalities, really in terms of the majority that we've seen in that student visa category have been from China, Colombia, and Brazil. And we'll have a look at the total top 10 breakdown later in the presentation. But when we consider that the market in student visas, overall had declined by 47%, what you'll note here when it breaks down by visa types is that student visas were very closely aligned to the Department of Education reported 2020 results, the 43%. But the greatest impact was actually in the non-student visa category. The visitor visa market declining around 68% and the working holiday declining 61%. On this slide, you'll note we have representation for other visas, and other visas here are predominantly students that were enrolled but may not, offshore, but may not have had a visa actually accepted, and so they weren't on a visa at that time. And so institutions that were teaching students in the 2020 period that didn't have a visa process grouped those students in the survey data under other. So the other visas sort of taken a little bit of an anomaly in this data set, but it's actually a really useful insight, particularly when we look at the number of students studying by top source destinations, countries, and breaking that down by visa types. It gives a bit of a, I guess, more clarity around which countries have adopted and started to move from traditional online, traditional face-to-face study and actually were undertaking some of their study offshore. So taking a closer look now around our average duration, it was sort of a little bit interesting looking at the average duration, whereby in overall student volumes, the number of student weeks declined, so 47% decline across students. We saw different cohorts in this duration study for different periods to what we'd normally see. So normally we have just over 13 weeks average study, and in fact it actually grew slightly to about 14 weeks on average. Student visas must, predominantly those that were here in Australia at time of border closures, it would appear that that's actually increased the average duration of those that were in Australia on a student visa. And so the student visa, decreased, declined from average 16 weeks to 15.2, but across the different cohorts of visitor actually increased a little bit, working holiday increased a little bit. So it's kind of a bit of a mixed bag between, I think, those students that were in Australia before the border closures and what impact that's had on their actual duration and stay. At a regional level, the Asia Pacific dominates. Of the 1.2 million weeks that were taught in 2020, over 700,000 of that clearly were in the Asia Pacific region. The Americas appears to have had the sort of least amount of decline. Again, as we've sort of analysed the statistics, particularly those that students were onshore from Colombia didn't have quite as big impact. Brazil, in some markets, in some states and territories, not as big an impact as well. And therefore, those nationalities were a little bit shielded from when the border closures came. And as we know, they commenced in Asia before the full national international borders were closed as well. But Europe, the greatest proportion of decline overall, albeit at about 1/10 of the overall weeks that come out of Asia Pacific. And then for those that want to think about where the duration of the students has largely been, as you'll note, the students that were here from in the Americas tended to study longer and had a greater duration, followed up by Middle East and North Africa, or Africa in this rating. Our largest demographic in Asia Pacific, around 12 weeks, and that's put the most impact on the student visa category and brought the decline down in the overall student visa category. Now I'll just look at that in terms of our economic impact and what, I guess it's probably a fairly straight correlation in terms of the volume of decline. Europe, the highest number of student weeks, highest number of decline in both student weeks and student numbers. And so the European economic impact was the greatest as well. With Asia Pacific, the actual dollar value was most significant, and at 54%, that really took a large volume of market out of the Australian economy. But the Americas was probably the most shielded in terms of actually students in country pre-border closure. Of our top 20 source countries, most of the makeup remained relatively the same. of the proportion of students, a greater percentage of those students are now made up in the top 10. So it increased from around 70% last year up to 74%. China remained the number one source destination. In the increase, the 48% increase, and as we'll look a little bit later, the week's increase on equivalent or greater ratio. Colombia, onshore, here before border closures, 25% decline, actually moved Colombia ahead of Japan. And for Japan, it was number 2 last year. And in a number of states, traditionally Japan had been number 1. But over this past 12 months, even in those states, it actually has reduced down in terms of its overall market position. The biggest sort of change just on that former slide would be Nepal and the introduction of Nepal into the top 10. Nepal actually came in from number 11 up to number 7, and Spain therefore dropped off. Once again, looking at sort of the visa statistics, largely in the student visa population, onshore here before border closures, and it appears that they've continued to study whilst they've been on those visas in Australia, and therefore the overall market decline at 13% was the lowest of any of the top 10 source countries. I mentioned earlier the volume of students in the other category when we looked at the visa types, and here we can see, particularly in China, that the number of students that have been recorded as studying on another visa type from China was the largest volume of all of the categories. There's some in the other category for Colombia. There's some obviously you can pick up in Brazil, Taiwan, Nepal, but the vast majority of those students were recorded from China. The actual number in terms of a percentage rose from a 3% share of the Chinese market in 2019 up to 18% of the total Chinese market recorded in 2020 were on other visas. Within that, it's safe to assume that many of those were doing sort of pathway English programs and therefore elected to continue study whilst offshore and online. Hopefully some good indicators around where we can see the market potentially offering some sustained opportunity whilst our borders are closed as well. The largest share of non-student visas still remains Japan, and within that, I guess it's 45% of that market still comes from visitor holder, albeit it declined from 53% last year. And second would be South Korea in terms of the makeup of the students being from both student and non-student visa. Unfortunately, we're probably likely to see greater impacts in 2021 of those markets that have had the non-student visa market previously. And in this year's survey, it'll be quite interesting to again observe what happens in the other visa category if we've got a sustained period where we need to teach students in an offshore cohort. On our largest increases, I think we can look at it and acknowledge there's some very new entrants in the largest increases with Kenya, Oman, East Timor, Belarus, and Macedonia. But the actual numbers are very small in terms of the actual numbers that have come through. It just represented more in the largest increase percentage-wise. Of the largest decreases, more concerning when you look at those top 10 markets that are represented, particularly here across China, Japan, and Brazil in the top 4. And the volume of students percentage change, China alone losing 17,000 students in that month, which, as you observed, was bigger than the top 4 number overall. So with Brazil, so the number that was declined from China actually represented more students than than we'd actually had in 2019 from Brazil at the time. Proportionally, that change, so we had a 48% change in student weeks, both from China in weeks and student numbers, but Japan, the impact of all of those other visa types exponentially increased the proportion of decline. What I'm going to do now is just quickly have a look at the provider type data, and in here the vet schools saw the highest share of students. So when we have a look at the actual breakdown of students by provider type, bring that up to you here in a sec. Of the share, it actually represented that vet schools increased from 26%. Sorry, the slide's just not coming up for me here at the moment. From 26% to 34% of market share in terms of schools. And just a reminder, the categorization is that if a school teaches English but also has pathways into a university, it would be considered as a university-based provider. If it has English only, it would be a standalone provider. English into a vet-based college, it would be classed as a vet-based provider, or multi-sector if it teaches English and then through to courses across both vocational and higher education. University proportion, so I mentioned vet still remains the highest total number, followed by standalone in terms of the actual student numbers represented. Universities actually increased from last year. The proportion of students that were in the university segment was 21%, and that increased from 21 to 29 because of their capacity to bring those students on in the online offshore cohort. But yeah, vet, as I mentioned, increased mainly because of the onshore cohort and some of the countries which were sort of noted just a bit earlier on in the presentation. On the next one, what I'll just quickly look at is the breakdown of source by provider types. I mentioned again here, we can sort of look at where different college types saw the majority of their students from, as referenced in the categories of why we saw students increase. So of the Americas, those students that typically had some of the smaller declines, particularly Colombia, would have been here before border closures and able to continue to study. The vast majority of those students were actually in vet-based colleges. Running that in terms of the way in which independent colleges were most impacted was either by the vet students, sorry, the American students over here sustained some, but the European students and the size of the decline in the European students of the independent colleges has had a significant impact on those type of providers. Asia Pacific still dominates in the university sector as the largest share. I'm now going to hand over to Svetlana, and Svetlana will do an overview of all of the state-related data. Thanks, Svetlana.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you for providing us the overall data of the annual ELICOS survey. So moving forward with the state overview, we can see here in 2020, Queensland experienced the biggest decline in terms of year-on-year among Australian states at 51%. So, but in terms of absolute numbers, we can see that New South Wales had the biggest drop at 35,550 students in 2020. But on the other hand, South Australia was the only state with a decline of less than 40%. But looking at the average length of stay, Western Australia enjoyed longer student stays with an average length of 12.3 weeks, and thus it only experienced a 38% decrease in terms of student weeks. Victoria, on the other hand, had the third biggest drop, both in student numbers and student weeks. However, it saw a increase, it welcomed an increase of its average length of stay from 15.1 weeks in 2019 to 16 weeks in 2020. So looking at just the overview of the development of each state, so we can see here that from the past 5 years, we can see here in 2020, it dropped, obviously on its student numbers and student weeks. From 2019, it drastically, unfortunately, decreased in 2020. So looking at source regions per state, we can see here that Asia Pacific continued to dominate the market share across all states, despite the biggest decrease in absolute numbers, so as Brett previously mentioned. But on the other hand, looking at the Americas region, Queensland actually had the largest share. It welcomed 30% of the source region from the Americas, and it was followed by the Western Australia at 27% market share from the Americas region. So we will be looking into the source regions and source markets for each state in the following slides. Moving forward with New South Wales, the state continued to have the highest market share across all states, both in student numbers and student weeks. So the market share of New South Wales in student numbers is at 39% in 2020 and at student weeks at 37%. So the average length of New South Wales from 13.6 in 2019, it actually decreased to 12.7. So just looking at here, the dropped in student numbers and student weeks in 2020. So student numbers, as I mentioned, it's 45%, and student weeks slightly with 48%. We're looking at the ELICOS students by visa type. So we can see here all of course, as Brett mentioned, student visas and the non-student visas. We expected a decrease on that. Student visa decreased 39%, and while visitor visa and of course working holiday visa naturally dropped in 2020. So 68% and 62% respectively for those two non-student visa. So just a quick snapshot of the study location of students in New South Wales in 2020. So the state started at Q1 from Q1 2020 at 9% of its students studying offshore. So this data is actually from our quarterly scheme. We've done it last year, and however, by the end of the year, so we can see here that the state delivered offshore classes to 56% of the students. So from 9% at Q1 2020, offshore students at New South Wales increased to 56% at the end of the year in 2020. So we can see here the shift in online and blended classes and adaptability of ELICOS colleges, but at the same time, of course, the continuing interest of students to study despite the border closures. With the top 10 source countries for New South Wales, Colombia became New South Wales' second highest source market, as both Brazil and Japan dropped, with Brazil with a decrease at 44% and Japan at 60%. So we can see here that China remained, of course, its top source market. And looking at the other countries, so Nepal replaced South Korea in the top 5 source countries for New South Wales. It only experienced, actually, as we can see here, it's only 0% change, but actually experienced only a decline of 5 students in 2020. So just looking at the top 5 source countries and in terms of students and student weeks. So as we can see here, China, Colombia, Brazil, Japan, and as I mentioned, Nepal joined in student numbers. As for the student weeks, Nepal joined the rankings as well from previously. So it's actually on the 4th now as a top source country for weeks. Looking at the top 10 source countries for main provider types. So this slide shows the different provider types we have for each state. And we would like to note that the schools and private higher education were not included on this slide as the numbers were too small. But looking at this, university-based centers are heavily reliant on China, as it continues to represent more than half of the student population. And as we can see on the university-based source countries, Asia Pacific continues to dominate the student population for this provider type. As for the standalone colleges, Brazil remains to be a key source market. And of course, with vet-based colleges. So overall, standalone colleges, multi-sector, and vet providers have a more diverse student population if we compare it to university-based in New South Wales. Just looking at the student volume by provider type, so we can see here with the vocation and education and training schools had the biggest share of the market in 2020 from 25.2% in 2019. It increased to 42% in 2020 in student numbers. Moving on to Queensland. Queensland faced, as I mentioned, faced the biggest drop in terms of year-on-year change if we compare it across all states in Australia. So this was also reflected in the average length of stay of the state, which decreased to 12.6 weeks in 2020 from 13.5 in 2019. Seeing here just the performance of the state over the past 10 years. So we can see here the 51% dropped in student numbers, and with a slightly higher decrease in student weeks at 54%. So for the students, just a snapshot of the Queensland students by visa type. So the student visa holders decreased by 46% in 2020 year on year. And with the visitor visa and working holiday with, of course, a bigger drop at 72 and 69% respectively. And as we can see here, the other visa actually increased, and as Brett previously mentioned, this is due to the offshore students who were counted by colleges who are actually on a pending visa and who actually had no visa application or in 2020. So those cohort of students were counted on the other visa, hence the increase of 17% in 2020. Share of ELICOS students by study location in Queensland. So from 1% in Q1 2020, it increased to 39% in Q4 2020 with offshore students studying, gradually studying from Q2 to Q4 in 2020. Just looking at Queensland's top 10 source countries, China replaced Japan. So we can see here Japan in 2019 at 7,646 students. It dropped to 67% at 2,537 students. So China replaced Japan as the top source market. And looking at China and Colombia, both the top two source countries for Queensland actually fared best compared to the other countries, with just over a 30% decline for China and 35% for Colombia. So just since we have already viewed the students, so just looking at China, Colombia, Japan, Brazil, South Korea for student top 5 source countries for students in Queensland. And for student weeks, China rose from 3rd spot in 2019 in 2020. So it's increase in from its spot in student numbers. So it actually reflected on its student weeks. So as we can see here, it's now the top source country, both for student numbers and student weeks for Queensland. Japan's dropped reflected with its student numbers. So its student numbers declined 67% and its student weeks declined bigger at the 74% in 2020. Just looking at the top 10 source country for main provider types, in Queensland, the Americas region continued to be the key source market for vocational education training schools. So we can see here with Colombia at 27% of the market share and Brazil at 20% market share. University-based are more reliant on China in 2020 as it represents 62% of the student population. So from 2019, it was only at 36% market share. So in 2020, it increased to 62%. And as Brett previously mentioned, it is of course due to the capacity of universities to have offshore students and of course those who are actually on their pathway programs. Looking at student volume by provider type, so standalone colleges still had the highest market share in 2020. However, university-based colleges increased from 7.9% in 2019 to 32.1% in 2020. And we can actually correlate this with China's performance being the top source market for Queensland and at the same time for university-based schools. Moving to South Australia. So South Australia had the smallest share in student numbers of all states. However, its market share increased in 2020, rising to 4% in 2020 from 3% in 2019. So alongside the decreases of 13% in student weeks, there's actually a longer average length of stay at 13.5 weeks as compared to 10 weeks in 2019. And looking at South Australia's performance over the past 10 years, so we can see here that student numbers declined at 36%. So it actually fared better compared to the previous states. And its student weeks with only a decrease of 13%. ELICOS students by visa type in South Australia. So the student visa share holders performance in year-on-year decreased by 44%. And of course, we expect that the decrease in visitor visas and working holiday with 60% and 51% decline respectively. So looking at the other visas, we can see here that there's actually a big increase at 419%. But we look at it in detail with other visas. So China is the top source market for this cohort of students. 94% of them are enrolled as offshore students. And looking at the ELICOS students by study location in 2020 from our quarterly scheme. So from Q1 2020, we can see here the 5% of students studying offshore. And then it from 5%, it increased to 62% and ended the year at 84% of students in South Australia actually studying offshore. With South Australia's top 10 source countries, so having being sixth in 2019, Colombia joined the top 5 source markets, and it actually replaced India. So it had a 24% increase in terms of year-on-year. And China remains the top source market, and of course, followed by Japan. Looking into detail the student numbers of the top 5 source countries, we can see here, so Colombia, as I previously mentioned, experienced an increase And we can see here actually the slight increase of 44 students, and China with a decrease of 38%, but with less than 715 students. Looking at the student weeks, Saudi Arabia replaced South Korea on the list of top source markets in terms of student weeks, and Colombia's increase in student numbers reflected on its student weeks as it experienced a 33% year-on-year performance. The top 10 source countries for main provider types in South Australia, looking at standalone colleges, the largest market share are from the Americas. So we can see here Brazil at 20%, followed by Colombia as well with 20%. University-based had an increase of market share, and with China at 63%. So majority of the students from university-based colleges were reported from China. And we can actually associate this with the provider type having the capacity and flow of students who are moving on to higher education degrees. Student volume by provider types in South Australia. So we can see here that university-based colleges have the largest market share. We can associate this with the same with Queensland, with China as the top source market, wherein 78% of students are enrolled in this provider type. And then we can see here, it is followed by standalone colleges at 25% market share, and followed by vocation and education training at 12.8%. For Victoria, Victoria continued to have the second largest share both in student numbers and student weeks of all states. So its market share of student numbers remained the same as 2019 at 26%, while student weeks market share at 31% across Australia. So looking at Victoria's performance over the past 10 years, we can see here the immediate drop from 2019 to 2020, with almost 47% decline in student numbers and student weeks at 44%. With just a look at the ELICOS students by visa type for Victoria. So we can see here that student visa declined at 48%. And of course, as expected with visitor visa and working holiday, with slightly bigger for, it's bigger than the student visa for visitor visa at 60%, and then working holiday at 39%. We can associate, so other visas actually experience only a slight decline of 5%. And as mentioned, you can associate this with those students who are studying offshore and were classified here by the colleges under other visa. The share of ELICOS students by study locations, of course, increased in over the course of the year of 2020. So from 1% in Q1 2020, it increased to 61% in Q4 2020 as expected. For the top 10 source countries for Victoria, the top 5 source markets for the state remained the same. Colombia performed better than the others with almost 30% year-on-year decline. But looking at China here as the top source market, so from 11,889 students, it dropped to 5,749 students for 2020. For the performance of Victoria's top 5 source countries for students and student weeks. So the top 5 countries, both for students and weeks, remain the same for 2020 in the state. The decreases with both countries, with both students and weeks also reflected in comparison to their performances. So we can see here that China's decline of in student numbers at 52% reflected on its student weeks at slightly less than at 48% decrease. And then with Colombia, with just almost 30% less in 2020, it reflected with its student weeks at 36% decline. For the top source countries for the provider types in Victoria, so standalone colleges, the student source markets for this college, for this provider type remain the same. So we can see here with China at 18%, top source market and the market share, and followed by Colombia at 16%. For university-based, China continues to have the largest market share at 59%. So if we compare this in 2019, China's market share was 39%, so it grew to 20% more in the 2020 for university-based colleges. While Colombia and Thailand remain the top two source countries for vocation and education training schools. So from 19%, Colombia increased to 25% on its market share for vet-based schools. And for Thailand, it actually increased to 12%. From 12%, it declined to 10% market share. Looking at the provider types with the student volume by provider types in Victoria. So the market share for vet-based schools increased from 31.5% in 2019 to 38.7% in 2020. So this can be associated with this provider type of vet-based schools top source country, which is Colombia, having a better performance in comparison to standalone colleges top source country, which is China. And lastly, moving to Western Australia, Western Australia maintained its market share in student numbers at 7%. And it experienced an increase in student weeks from 6% in 2019 to 7% in 2020. So that's the market share in terms of student numbers and student weeks for Western Australia. Its average length of stay also increased from 10.9 weeks in 2019 to 12.3 weeks in 2020. So all students in this state in Western Australia continued to study at city-based providers. So we can see here at 100% of the student market studied in city-based providers. And looking at Western Australia's performance over the past 10 years, so we see here the drop in student numbers at 46%. And with student weeks at slightly better not figures, I would say at 38%. With Western Australia's students by visa type, so the student visa cohort experienced a 38% decline year on year in 2020, and with a visitor visa and working holiday with 65% and 66% respectively year-on-year decline. And Western Australia's student cohorts study location, so from 5% in Q1 2020, it increased, the offshore students increased in at 18% for Q4 2020. And for Western Australia's top 10 source countries, so the top 5 source countries remain the same with China, Colombia, Japan, Brazil, Taiwan. And Colombia, looking at Colombia specifically, it replaced Japan in the second spot, as it only saw a decrease of 12% in 2020. So we can see here Japan experienced a 51% drop in its student numbers. So the top 5 source countries for Western Australia in terms of student numbers, so we can see here that China experienced 928 less students for 2020. And then it's with Colombia with only 123 less than students for 2020. So this explains the year-on-year performance of Colombia with only 12% decline. In terms of student weeks, Colombia is now the top source market for 2020 in Western Australia. So from the third spot in terms of student weeks, it is now at the first spot, as both Brazil and China experienced decreases with almost 50% of its student weeks in Western Australia. And for the top 10 source countries on main provider types in the state, Colombia is the key source market for standalone colleges in 2020. It actually replaced Brazil for this year. So Colombia is now at 17% of the market share of standalone colleges, and with Brazil at 14%. For the multi-sector provider, China replaced Japan as the key source market. So it's now China has now the 27% of the student population for this provider type. And university-based schools, as we can see here, are also heavily reliant, comparing it to other states as well. So China holds the 53% of the market share of university-based in Western Australia. And it actually increased from 38% in 2019 to 53% in 2020. And lastly, looking at the student volume by provider type. So student numbers, in terms of student numbers, market share of student population in the state studied in standalone colleges at 71% of the student population. So this actually increased the share. If we compare this in 2019, it was only at 45%, and now it decreased to 71.3% in 2020. And of course, we can associate this with the better performance of this provider type due to its top source country, which is Colombia, which only experienced, as I previously mentioned, a 12% decline. So now back to Brett. I hope that provides everyone a more detailed insight of each states, and passing on now to Brett for the rest of the presentation on the COVID-19 impact.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Really exceptional detail on the state level. This year, we've introduced a few new questions, and for providers that have been undertaking the quarterly ELICOS survey, you'll note that we have, throughout the last year, looked at a few different key points of analysis which really support the way in which, from English Australia's role, can advocate on behalf of the sector. So the data itself in terms of student numbers, adding in the student weeks is really important, but you'll note we've actually added some other questions, particularly around changes to employment, which has been a key attribute of the quarterly survey. So in the annual, we again added a few additional questions, and thanks to all the colleges that participated and responded. Looking at one of those in particular, the first was around the loss of revenue, and of the providers in that responded on this question, we were looking to see what impact on a financial basis had occurred. As you can see, it's quite dramatic in the extent that over 40% of the respondents had noted that they had experienced more than 50% decline in business loss in revenue. So between 51 and 75% loss, and 64% if you actually add in the greater number between the 76 to 100% loss, had experienced their own revenue decline between 50 and 100%. Again, it really does start to translate those numbers, particularly the student numbers and student weeks, back into a practical sense of the actual impact on a business. Looking further, we actually asked colleges how they felt in terms of their sentiment moving forward and where they thought the trajectory would be. Now, of course, this is a little dated a little earlier this year, and perhaps at the moment sentiment would change even further, given what we're currently experiencing with further lockdowns and border restrictions and discussions around reducing incoming passenger loads even further. But just looking at what the results showed, essentially 2021, most providers were really, I guess, pessimistic to the extent that there was no real recovery foresaw this year. 60% in fact felt there was no recovery in 2021. If you added in those that even thought there may be some recovery, 1 to 20%, that took up 80% of the providers. So the vast share, over 80%, thought that the best case would be a 20% recovery on last year. 2022 held some hope. If you look at the middle proportion of the group that responded, felt that they could actually, from where they were last year in 2020, perhaps recover up to 40 to 60% of their business back in 2022. And it started to sort of waver quite a bit, and nobody really saw that there would be a recovery back to where we were in 19 at very least by the end of 2022. 2023, and I guess this is a much more longer term view. There was more positive views in the across the market, and generally around 94% of the people felt that they would have between 40 and 100% recovery come 2023. Again, I think that's very reasonable, and by the time where we are at the moment, though, there are so many unknowns that I think if we were to do the survey again today, some of those market trajectories may even be slightly worse than what they were showing now. We actually mapped in the survey also around the student responses, and I think it's good to note what the different ways in which providers reacted to over the year in 2020. 48%, you can note, of the students that were here in Australia continued to study, and I think that's been borne out in the data of those nationalities where we're seeing the smaller decrease, if I could phrase it that way. They were in Australia, they decided to stay. On the other side, you could see that there was about 32% of that cohort that either cancelled their program and sought a refund or took a deferral in 2020 as well. And again, the deferrals would be contributing to the economic decline. The only maybe slight glimmer of hope was that 16% of the proportion that actually commenced their programs offshore, and hopefully the innovation and particularly the program which English Australia is administering at the moment through the Innovation Fund, hopefully we can see that 16% provide further opportunity in the coming months of this year, and it'll be interesting to see what that looks like in the 2021 results. Looking at the way of what, again, ranking the way in terms institutions responded, I think it's testament to the quality of our sector that 94% provided support to students. We had to innovate, with 92% changing their mode of delivery. I referenced that of the student market, 32% had actually either opted to defer or cancel. You can see that over 90% of providers had to take some action. There's a couple in here which pull out the staffing and staff that had to be reduced in 2020 alone. And I know, just talking to many college owners, that's carried further into 2021 now, but 84% of colleges had to reduce staff, and another 64% were required to take leave. In here, I guess the proportion that had the government support, 74%, was probably the biggest indicator of why we haven't seen as many colleges close, albeit vastly reduce their overheads and other costs to try and survive. And just lastly, Svetlana's mentioned throughout the survey on the proportion that moved to online. And it's just, I think, a remarkable proportion in our last slide, where we look at the proportion of students that went from 1% in studying online or offshore in Q1 last year up to half the market that were studying online offshore this year. Again, we've sort of given the breakdown already on the state analysis. That concludes today's webinar presentation. We're spot on the hour that's been allocated for the time. All of the participants that contributed to the survey will be writing directly to your colleges to provide a copy of the full report. And equally, as I mentioned, we'll be publishing the executive summary for the report, as well as this webinar recording, which will be made live on the English Australia website. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar. Special thanks to Svetlana for all of your support through the program administration of the survey and today's presentation. We will be doing a separate presentation in the coming weeks for the Q1 quarterly ELICOS market survey, and a separate announcement will be made to provide additional information around the dates and the time for the Q1 2021 survey. Special thanks to all of the colleges that participated in the annual and continue to support the quarterly surveys. Again, I can't state enough just how powerful the data is in terms of the support we can advocate on your behalf. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care. See you soon. Bye, buddy.